Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Romney, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for the hearing. I'd like to get a sense of, there's a lot of energy and passion around, was it from an animal or was it a lab leak? And I must admit, I don't understand why there's so much energy around that. It strikes me that we'll never be 100% sure, I presume, about one or the other. We might be 98% or something, but we'll always be a little uncertain. And given the fact that it could have been either, we know what action we ought to take to protect from either. And so why there's so much passion around it makes me think it's more political than scientific, but maybe I'm wrong. So the action, it strikes me that based on what I've heard, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. What I heard was there's no particular reason for it other than military warfare. We shouldn't do that anyway. So one, we know that. Whether it came from an animal or not, we shouldn't be financing gain-of-function research. Number two, we should insist that any place we send money follows the international ISO standards. I didn't get the number, Dr. Kovalinks, but you had a number there that suggested that people have to follow. So we shouldn't be getting money or going to labs that don't follow those international standards. And number three, whether it was from a wet market or the Wuhan lab, China's to blame. Both those things were in China. And so if we're looking for someone to blame, we know who it is. It's the Chinese, and they should take responsibility for it and should have opened themselves up to complete disclosure. So am I wrong here? Is there a reason there's so much energy around whether it came from a wet market or a lab? In both cases, the action is simple. We should clean up the wet labs, and number two, we should tighten the wet markets, and number two, we should tighten the labs. What? Please, go ahead, Dr. Quay.
Well, I'll just say briefly, I mean, I think the energy is around the fact that paychecks, salaries, careers are based on continuing gain-of-function research by some of the most vocal people in this debate. And I think if you follow the money, you'll see the answer.
Thank you. Dr. Gary, what's your thought?
Well, a lot of the talk around gain-of-function research depends on how you define it, and the definition is very important. I mean, there's some informal definitions that are very technical definitions. I mean, we have to get that part right, because if you define it in a way that basically interferes with a lot of biomedical research on viruses and on other things too, cancer research, everything, you're going to really cripple the biomedical research enterprise. So let's get that right. I don't think, just blanket we should stop funding all gain-of-function research, because some of that is important, like, for developing animal models of new diseases as they come forth. You have to select for a virus that can actually replicate in a distinct animal that you can use in the lab. So if you don't permit gain-of-function research, we won't be able to respond to a new threat because we won't be able to make animal models. So getting that right, getting that definition right is very important. I think that the Office of Science and Technology Policy new guidelines for this type of research is very clear. It's a good step forward. You should look at that and see what you can do best to codify that into some kind of legislation.
Yeah, Dr. Ebright, do you concur with that point of view, that we need to define exactly what kind of research is okay and which is not, which has a beneficial purpose and which has only malevolent purpose?
The definition of gain-of-function research has been clear. There is a legally controlling official definition from the U.S. policy that was in effect from 2014 to 2017, and there has been an official legally controlling definition in the U.S. policy that has been in effect from 2018 to the present. The definitions have never been in question, but the intensity that you asked about at the start of your series of questions, the intensity comes from those who are practitioners of gain-of-function research and related high-risk research on potential pandemic pathogens, who have for 2 decades successfully resisted federal oversight of their activities, for 2 decades who have insisted on self-regulation without external oversight, and who would like this to continue, despite the very real possibility even though, as you say, not a certainty, of the fact, the very real possibility that SARS-CoV-2, a pandemic that killed 20 million and cost 25 trillion, may have come from precisely that category of research. That is the basis of the intensity. Only after there is an acknowledgement, and I see this acknowledgement today in a bipartisan fashion among members of this committee from both parties, only after there is an acknowledgement that there is a very real possibility, not a remote possibility, but a very real possibility of a lab origin, will there be the political will to impose regulation on this scientific community that has successfully resisted and obstructed regulation for 2 decades. Every other component of biomedical research that poses risks or has significant consequences has regulation, federal regulation with force of law in place. There's regulation of human subjects research. There's regulation of vertebrate animal research. There's regulation of embryonic stem cell research. But in this category of research, which is the most significant in terms of consequences and potentially existential risk, there is almost no regulation with force of law. No regulation with force of law for biosafety, for any pathogen other than the smallpox virus, and no regulation with force of law for biorisk management for any pathogen. That needs to change. That's what produces this intensity.
And it strikes me that whether COVID came from a lab or it came from a wet market, that issue still has to be addressed.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not going to get so excited about where COVID happened to come from. What I know is that something very dangerous could come from gain-of-function research if it's not properly regulated. How to define where those boundaries are and what one can do and one can't do, that's something that we ought to be focused on. Even if we became 98% sure it came from a wet market, that wouldn't mean that gain-of-function research could by itself become a huge danger to humanity, and therefore we ought to regulate it. Is that something that you gentlemen agree with, or am I making a mistake?
I completely agree with you, Senator Romney. That's well stated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Hall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Thanks for the witnesses for being here. You know, I have to say, I think one of the worst things